Subscribe to Infidelity Tales Lab for more stories. Now let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Unwelcome Truth. Fernando Wallace stared at the text message on his phone, reading it for the third time as winter rain pelted against his downtown office window. The words hadn't changed, but each reading felt like a fresh punch to the gut. "Dad, don't come for Christmas. You'll just embarrass us in front of Vaughn's family. Mom says you'll make everything awkward. Just don't." Ashley, 47 years old, CFO of Sentinel Capital Group, commanding a portfolio worth north of $3 billion, and his 23-year-old daughter thought he was an embarrassment. Fernando set the phone down carefully, his jaw tight. Across his mahogany desk, Greg Forbes, his business partner of 15 years, watched with knowing eyes. "Let me guess," Greg said. "Deirdre is doing?" Fernando nodded once. 3 years since the divorce, and his ex-wife still wielded their daughter like a weapon. The split had been Deirdre's idea. She declared him emotionally unavailable and boring after 22 years of marriage. Within 4 months, she'd married Vaughn Palmer, a flashy entrepreneur with a Tesla, a yacht, and enough charm to convince Ashley that her father was the villain of their family story. "Your daughter's young," Greg offered. "She'll figure out." "Will she?" Fernando pulled up another message, this one from 2 weeks ago. Deirdre had sent it from Ashley's phone. "Nobody likes you anyway. You're just bitter that I found someone better. Stay away from our family." Our family. As if Ashley had never been his daughter. As if 23 years of bedtime stories, soccer games, and college tuition had evaporated the moment Deirdre decided she wanted something more exciting than a man who worked 60-hour weeks to give them a comfortable life. Fernando had been called many things in his career: ruthless, calculating, ice cold. He'd earned those labels by making the hard decisions that kept Sentinel Capital at the top of the private equity world. He could read a balance sheet like poetry and spot a failing company from a mile away. But none of that mattered when it came to his daughter's rejection. "I'm going anyway," Fernando said quietly. Greg raised an eyebrow. "To Christmas dinner? That's bold. It's my daughter's first Christmas in her new house. I wasn't there for her wedding because Deirdre made sure I wasn't invited. I won't miss this too." "Fernando," Greg hesitated. "You've been working on the Palmer account. You know it's complicated." Fernando smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I know exactly how complicated it is. The Palmer account. 6 months ago, the name Vaughn Palmer had crossed Fernando's desk attached to a proposal for a major investment deal. Palmer Technologies needed capital for expansion, $50 million to scale their revolutionary business model. Greg had brought the file to Fernando's attention because the numbers looked promising. But Fernando Wallace hadn't built his reputation by trusting surface numbers. He dug deeper, and what he found made his blood run cold. Vaughn Palmer wasn't just a successful entrepreneur. He was a predator who'd built his empire by crushing dreamers under his Italian loafers. His company's revolutionary model involved identifying struggling inventors and small business owners, promising them salvation, then systematically stripping them of their intellectual property and assets before discarding the husks of their former dreams. Fernando had found 12 victims so far, 12 families destroyed, 2 bankruptcies that led to divorces, 1 suicide, and Vaughn Palmer had walked away from each disaster richer and more confident, his reputation somehow untarnished because he was smart enough to stay on the right side of the law, barely. "The Palmer deal," Fernando said, "is moving forward. He'll get his answer at the board meeting next week." "Before Christmas?" "Exactly before Christmas." Greg studied his partner's face. They'd been through enough hostile takeovers and corporate battles for him to recognize the look in Fernando's eyes. "You're not just playing businessman here, are you? Vaughn Palmer married my wife, turned my daughter against me, and built his fortune on the backs of people who trusted him." Fernando's voice remained steady, controlled. "He has no idea who I am. Deirdre kept her maiden name professionally, and Ashley changed hers to Palmer after the wedding. He thinks he's dealing with Fernando Wallace, CFO. He has no clue I'm Deirdre's boring ex-husband." "Jesus." Greg leaned back. "When does he find out?" Fernando checked his watch. "Christmas Day. When I show up to dinner and explain exactly why Palmer Technologies' future is in my hands." Chapter 2. The Devil You Know. 6 months earlier, Fernando had been in his office late when Greg knocked and entered without waiting, a thick folder in his hands. Got something interesting. Palmer Technologies. Young CEO, growing fast, needs capital. Specifics. Fernando had asked, not looking up from his computer screen. 50 million ask. They've developed a platform that connects inventors with investors. Sounds promising. Palmer. Fernando had frozen. First name, Vaughn. You know him? Fernando had known the name. All right. 3 months prior, his daughter had called with news that gutted him. Dad, Vaughn and I are getting married next month. It's going to be small, just family. Mom's family. The message was clear. He wasn't invited to watch his only child get married. Now Greg was telling him Vaughn Palmer needed money. Fernando's money. Over the next 2 weeks, Fernando had conducted the most thorough due diligence of his career. He'd hired private investigators, forensic accountants, and even flew to 3 different cities to meet with Palmer's previous partners. What he discovered was systematic and cruel. Earl Leach had been the first person Fernando interviewed. The 62-year-old inventor met him at a diner in Cleveland, his hands shaking as he stirred his coffee. I spent 20 years developing my water purification system, Earl had said. Took out a second mortgage, maxed out credit cards. Then Vaughn Palmer walks into my life like an angel. Says he can give me funding, connections, everything I need. What happened? Fernando had asked, though he already suspected. Contract was 300 pages. My lawyer said it looked standard. Vaughn was so friendly, so enthusiastic. 6 months after I signed, he declared my company in material breach of some clause buried on page 273. Exercised his option to take full control. Fire me from my own company. Sold my patents to a Chinese manufacturer for $12 million. Earl's eyes had filled with tears. I got nothing. Lost my house. My wife left me. I wanted to die. But you didn't, Fernando had said gently. Couldn't do that to my kids. But Vaughn Palmer destroyed my life, and he did it with a smile on his face. Fernando had found 11 more stories, just like Earl's. Different details, same pattern. Vaughn Palmer was a wolf in expensive suits, and somehow he'd charmed Fernando's ex-wife and convinced Ashley that her father was the problem in their family. Back in the present, Fernando opened his desk drawer and pulled out a photograph. Ashley at her college graduation, beaming, his arm around her shoulders. That had been 4 years ago, before the divorce, before Deirdre's character assassination, before Vaughn Palmer. His phone buzzed. Another text from Deirdre. I mean it, Fernando. Don't you dare show up on Christmas. Vaughn has important guests coming, and your negative energy will ruin everything. Important guests. Fernando allowed himself a small smile. He knew exactly who those guests were. Potential investors from Pacific Rim Capital, one of Sentinel's subsidiary funds. They were coming because Greg had arranged it, dangling the possibility of involvement in the Palmer deal. The irony was exquisite. Vaughn was hosting investors that Fernando ultimately controlled, trying to secure funding that Fernando would decide, all while married to the woman who'd left Fernando for being unsuccessful at Real Connection. Deirdre always wanted excitement, Fernando murmured, pocketing his phone. She's about to get more than she bargained for. Chapter 3. Setting the table. 3 weeks before Christmas, Vaughn Palmer was feeling invincible. Palmer Technologies had grown 300% in 2 years. His personal net worth had cracked 8 figures. And he'd married Deirdre, beautiful, sophisticated Deirdre, who appreciated the finer things in life, unlike her boring ex-husband who she said had the personality of a tax return. Vaughn was hosting a small dinner party at his Mercer Island estate. 20 guests, including several business associates and Deirdre's mother, Helene Dillon. Ashley sat beside her stepfather, radiant in a designer dress, playing the role of doting daughter. To family, Vaughn toasted, raising his champagne flute. And to the future of Palmer Technologies. Is the Sentinel deal done? Asked Marcus Chun, one of Vaughn's board members. Almost. Vaughn's smile was confident. Meeting with their CFO next week. Just a formality. They need us as much as we need them. Deirdre squeezed his hand. Vaughn's being modest. They're desperate to get in on the ground floor. Across the table, Helene Dillon watched her son-in-law with calculating eyes. She'd never quite trusted Vaughn's smooth charm, but Deirdre had insisted he was everything Fernando wasn't: passionate, spontaneous, successful. Still, Helene remembered Fernando at family dinners, quietly competent, always making sure everyone was taken care of. He'd been a good father to Ashley. "Mom, you're doing that thing again," Deirdre said, noticing her mother's expression. "What thing?" "Thinking about Fernando." "Stop. He's in the past." Ashley shifted uncomfortably. Sometimes she thought about her father, too. The way he used to make her favorite pancakes on Sunday mornings, how he'd never missed a single school play even when he had important meetings. But Mom said he'd been emotionally manipulative, using his good deeds to control them. Vaughn had explained how some men are like that, subtle abusers who play the victim. "Your father sent you a Christmas card," Helene said quietly to Ashley. "Grandmother, please. I'm just saying you should read it." Vaughn interjected smoothly. "Helene, we all appreciate your concern, but Ashley's made her choice. Some relationships are toxic, even parent-child ones. Especially when the parent has information you don't want exposed," Vaughn thought privately. He'd been careful to make sure Deirdre kept Ashley away from Fernando. The last thing he needed was the girl talking to her father and, somehow, connecting dots. Meanwhile, in his downtown office, Fernando was in his final planning session with Greg. Spread across the conference table were documents detailing every aspect of Vaughn Palmer's business empire. "The board meets December 22nd, Greg said. 3 days before Christmas. That's when we'll deliver the verdict on the Palmer deal. And the verdict will be," Fernando asked, though he already knew, "conditional approval. $50 million, but with terms that put us in effective control of Palmer Technologies. Vaughn won't realize what he's signing until it's too late." "He'll realize on Christmas," Fernando said, "when I show up to dinner and introduce myself properly." Greg shook his head admiringly. "You've actually turned his need for our money into a trap. He's been trapping people for years. Tommy learned how it feels." "There's more," Greg said, pulling out another file. "I've been in contact with 8 of his victims. They're willing to go public the moment we give the word. Class action lawsuit ready to file. Federal regulators interested. Local news has a reporter who's been investigating Palmer for months, but couldn't get victims to talk on record. They'll talk now." Fernando studied the files. Earl Leach's name was on top, but there were others. A single mother who'd lost her small bakery chain. A veteran who'd invented a prosthetic device. A young couple whose app idea had been stolen. Each one a life derailed by Vaughn Palmer's greed. After Christmas, Fernando decided, let him have one last holiday, thinking he's won. Then we burn it all down. And Ashley? Fernando's expression softened slightly. She'll learn the truth. Maybe then she'll understand who her father really is. On December 22nd, Vaughn Palmer walked into the Sentinel Capital boardroom, expecting a celebration. Instead, he got a contract that would haunt him. Fernando sat at the head of the table, professional and distant, as lawyers explained the terms. Sentinel would provide $50 million, but in exchange, they'd hold controlling interest, board seats, and veto power over major decisions. "These terms are aggressive," Vaughn said, his charm faltering. "They're standard for an investment of this size in a company with limited proven track record," Fernando replied coolly. "You're free to seek other options." But Vaughn had already tried other options. Sentinel was his last, best hope. Without this money, Palmer Technologies would stall, maybe collapse. Investors were already nervous. "I need to discuss this with my wife," Vaughn said. "You have 48 hours, Fernando told him. "After that, the offer expires." Vaughn left the building in a cold sweat. 48 hours would take him right to Christmas Eve. He'd have to sign and ruin the holiday mood, or risk everything. That night, Deirdre found him in his study, staring at the contract. "What's wrong?" "The Sentinel deal. It's not what I expected." "But you'll sign it, right?" "We need this, Vaughn. The house, the cars, Ashley's lifestyle, all of it depends on Palmer Technologies succeeding." Vaughn heard the edge in her voice. Deirdre had expensive tastes, and lately she'd been pressuring him to maintain appearances. She'd left her previous husband because he was boring, but really it was because she'd wanted a bigger house, flashier vacations, a husband who impressed her friends. "I'll sign," Vaughn said. But it means Sentinel owns me now. As long as they pay, Deirdre said, kissing his cheek. Who cares? On Christmas Eve, Von Palmer signed a contract. Fernando Wallace had him exactly where he wanted him. Now came the final act, showing up to dinner uninvited and watching Vaughn's world crumble in real time. Chapter 4. The Gathering Storm. Christmas morning dawned cold and clear over Mercer Island. Inside the Palmer residence, Deirdre was in her element, directing caterers and florists with military precision. This Christmas dinner was about more than family. It was about image. Vaughn's business associates from Pacific Rim Capital would be there, along with select friends who moved in the right circles. Ashley was in the kitchen helping arrange appetizers when her phone buzzed. A text from her grandmother. Give your father a chance, sweetheart. People aren't always what others make them seem. She deleted it without responding. Grandmother Helene had always been soft on Dad, making excuses for his emotional distance. But Ashley remembered the truth. A father who was always working, always distracted, who showed love through money but never presence. Or at least, that's what Mom had spent 3 years convincing her to believe. Ashley, darling, put your phone away. Deirdre called from the dining room. Guests will be here in 2 hours. Vaughn was in his study, trying to calm his nerves. The Sentinel contract sat in his desk drawer like a ticking bomb. He'd signed away more control than he'd ever admitted to Deirdre. But it was fine. He'd done this before, bring in investors, then slowly squeeze them out with clever maneuvering. Fernando Wallace seemed like a typical corporate suit, smart with numbers but lacking street instincts. What Vaughn didn't know was that Fernando Wallace had spent the past 6 months studying him like a scientist studies a virus. Every business move, every pattern, every vulnerability had been cataloged and weaponized. At 11:30 a.m., Fernando stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie. He'd chosen a dark gray suit, professional, understated, perfect for the carnage he was about to unleash. In his pocket was a thumb drive containing evidence of Von Palmer's predatory business practices. In his briefcase were copies of the Sentinel contract with certain clauses highlighted. His phone rang. Greg Forbes. You're really doing this? Greg asked. I'm really doing this. The victims are standing by. Earl Leach, the others, they're ready to make statements the moment you give a signal. After dinner, Fernando said, I want Vaughn to squirm first. What about Ashley? Fernando paused, his reflection staring back at him. She needs to see who these people really are, even if it hurts. You're a cold bastard, Fernando. Today I need to be. By 1 p.m., the Palmer house was filled with guests. Champagne flowed, canapes made the rounds, and Deirdre held court in a stunning red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Vaughn worked the room with practiced ease, laughing at jokes, making connections, playing the role of successful entrepreneur. Ashley stood near the Christmas tree, chatting with her friend Rebecca Reed, when the doorbell rang. Deirdre was closest and opened it, her society smile already in place. The smile died instantly. Fernando Wallace stood on the doorstep, holding a bottle of expensive wine and wearing an expression of calm determination. Behind him, snow had begun to fall, creating an almost theatrical backdrop. Hello, Deirdre, he said quietly. Merry Christmas. The color drained from her face. What were you doing here? I was invited. By my daughter. It wasn't technically true, but it should have been. May I come in? Before Deirdre could respond, Ashley appeared at her mother's shoulder. Dad! Her voice was confused, almost childlike. I told you not to. I know what you told me, Ashley. I came anyway. We need to talk. Deirdre recovered quickly, her shock transforming into cold fury. You can't be here. I told you. Nobody likes me. I'm an embarrassment. You found someone better, Fernando recited calmly. Yes, I got all your messages. I'm here anyway. Now, are you going to make a scene in front of your guests? Or are you going to let me spend Christmas with my daughter? The standoff might have continued, but Von Palmer appeared in the foyer, drawn by the commotion. He was smiling, ready to handle whatever minor crisis had emerged. Then he saw Fernando Wallace. The color that had drained from Deirdre's face now drained from Vaughn's. His smile froze, then shattered. His voice came out as a strangled whisper. Mr. Wallace? What? What are you doing here? Chapter 5. The mask slips. The moment hung in the air like a blade. Around them, party conversation continued, guests unaware of the earthquake happening in the foyer. Ashley looked between her stepfather and her father, confusion written across her face. You two know each other? She asked. Fernando's expression remained neutral, but his eyes locked onto Vaughn with predatory focus. Oh, we know each other very well. Don't we, Vaughn? Though I don't think we've been properly introduced in a personal context. Vaughn's mind was racing. Fernando Wallace, the CFO who'd made him sign that brutal contract. The man who now controlled Palmer Technologies' future, standing in his house. On Christmas. How? Deirdre found her voice first. Vaughn, what's going on? How do you know Fernando? Vaughn struggled to form words. He's the CFO of Sentinel Capital, the company that just invested in Palmer Technologies. The wine bottle in Fernando's hand suddenly seemed less like a gift and more like a prop in a carefully staged play. Ashley's eyes widened as she began connecting dots she didn't fully understand yet. Invested, Fernando repeated with a slight smile. That's one way to put it. Another way would be acquired controlling interest. But we can discuss business later. Right now, I like to spend Christmas with my daughter. Surely that's not too much to ask. Deirdre stepped between them, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You bastard. This is about revenge, isn't it? You couldn't handle that I left you for someone better, so you're trying to... Someone better? Fernando's calm finally cracked slightly. Deirdre, you left me for a man who destroys people's lives for profit. You really should have done your due diligence. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Vaughn demanded, try to regain control. But there was sweat on his forehead now. Dad, please, Ashley interjected. Just go. You're making this weird. Ashley. Fernando's voice was gentle but firm. I know your mother has spent 3 years telling you I'm the villain, that I was absent, emotionally unavailable, that you're better off without me. But before I leave, and I will leave if you truly want me to, I need you to hear something. We don't have to hear anything from you, Deirdre snapped. But Fernando was already pulling out his phone, tapping a few buttons. Earl Leach's voice suddenly filled the foyer, playing from a recorded interview. Vaughn Palmer destroyed my life. 20 years of work gone. My marriage gone. He smiled the whole time he did it. Used legal loopholes to steal everything I'd built. Fernando swiped to the next recording. A woman's voice thick with tears. My bakery was my grandmother's dream. 3 generations. Palmer Technologies promised to help us expand. Instead, they systematically dismantled us. Took our recipes, our supplier contacts, everything. Then discarded us like trash. Turn that off, Vaughn said, his voice tight. Fernando kept playing recordings. A veteran inventor. A young tech entrepreneur. Story after story of people crushed under Vaughn Palmer's ambition. Guests had started to notice the commotion now, drifting toward the foyer with curious expressions. Stop it. Deirdre grabbed for the phone, but Fernando held it out of reach. These are the victims of your husband's business practices, Deirdre. 12 people so far. One of them committed suicide. Another lost custody of his children. And you, he turned to Vaughn, you built an empire on their broken dreams. Ashley had gone pale. Is this true? It's taken out of context, Vaughn said quickly. Business is complicated, Ashley. Sometimes deals don't work out. Don't work out. Fernando's voice hardened. You deliberately structured contracts to trap these people. Waited until they were desperate. Then exercise clauses that let you steal everything. That's not business, Vaughn. That's predation. The Pacific Rim capital investors had entered the foyer now, their expressions ranging from curious to alarmed. Deirdre saw her perfect Christmas dissolving into chaos. Get out, she hissed at Fernando. Get out of my house right now. Your house. Fernando pulled out another document, the deed records. Interesting, because according to county records, this house is mortgaged to the hilt. You're 3 months behind on payments. Vaughn's been juggling debt to maintain the lifestyle you've become accustomed to. Vaughn's face went scarlet. How dare you? I dare because I'm the one who now holds your debt, Vaughn. I bought it 2 weeks ago. Every mortgage, every line of credit, every personal loan. You work for me now. You live in my house. You drive my cars. Fernando's voice was cold as winter. And if you default, which, given the terms of our Sentinel contract, you're about to, I own everything. The room had gone dead silent. Ashley looked like she might be sick. Deirdre's carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time. You can't do this, Vaughn whispered. I already have. The contracts you signed give me controlling interest in Palmer Technologies. The debt acquisition gives me control of your personal assets. You played your victims perfectly, Vaughn. Unfortunately for you, I've been playing you since the moment your investment proposal crossed my desk 6 months ago. Why? Ashley's voice was small. Why would you do this? Fernando finally looked at his daughter, and for the first time, his expression softened. Because this man married your mother and turned you against me using the same manipulation tactics he uses in business. Because he's destroyed 12 families that I know of. Because he needed to be stopped. He paused. And because I wanted you to see the truth about who you've been living with. Chapter 6. The walls come down. The Christmas party had devolved into chaos. Guests whispered in corners. Several had already made excuses to leave. The Pacific Rim investors were in a heated discussion with Vaughn, their earlier friendliness replaced by cold calculation. They'd come to celebrate a partnership. Now, they were witnessing a hostile takeover. Deirdre had retreated to the kitchen, her face in her hands, while Helene Dillon, who'd arrived fashionably late, sat beside her daughter with an expression that said, I told you so, without speaking the words. In the study, Fernando stood with Ashley, Vaughn, and Greg Forbes, who'd arrived with a lawyer and several thick folders of documentation. It was time for the full reveal. Let me lay this out clearly, Fernando said, spreading documents across Vaughn's own desk. 6 months ago, you submitted a proposal to Sentinel Capital for a $50 million investment. You presented Palmer Technologies as an innovative platform connecting inventors with investors. What you failed to mention was your pattern of predatory acquisition. Those are business decisions, Vaughn started. They're fraud, Greg interrupted. We've had forensic accountants review every deal. The contracts you used were deliberately obfuscated. You've buried killer clauses that even experienced lawyers missed. You targeted people who were desperate, who didn't have resources to fight back. Fernando pulled up a photo on his tablet, showing it to Ashley. This is Michael Brennan, former Marine, developed a prosthetic device for wounded veterans. Vaughn promised to help him scale production. Instead, he took the patents, sold them to a Chinese manufacturer, and left Brennan with nothing but debt. Ashley stared at the photo, a middle-aged man with tired eyes. I don't understand. Vaughn said he helps people. He helps himself, Fernando corrected. He identifies vulnerable targets, gains their trust, then destroys them. It's systematic, calculated, cruel. Vaughn's earlier confidence had evaporated. He looked like a cornered animal. You can't prove intent. Every contract was legal. Legal isn't the same as ethical, Fernando replied. But you're right. You stayed on the right side of the law. Barely. That's why I had to get creative. He opened another folder. The Sentinel contract you signed gives us controlling interest. But what you didn't realize is that several clauses allow us to trigger immediate repayment of the full $50 million if you're found to be in material misrepresentation of your business practices. Vaughn's face went white. You can't. The lawsuits being filed tomorrow by 12 of your victims constitute material misrepresentation. Your failure to disclose your predatory pattern to potential investors is material misrepresentation, which means Fernando's smile was knife-sharp. You owe us $50 million immediately, which you don't have. This is extortion, Vaughn whispered. No, this is consequences. Fernando leaned forward. You've spent years operating without them. Now they've arrived. Ashley had been silent, processing everything. Finally, she spoke. What happens to Vaughn now? Fernando looked at his daughter. This was the moment. He could crush Vaughn completely, destroy him as thoroughly as Vaughn had destroyed his victims. He had the power, the means, the justification. But Ashley's eyes held something. Not sympathy for Vaughn, but a question. Who are you, Dad? Are you like him, or are you better? That depends, Fernando said slowly. Vaughn has two choices. Option 1, fight this. tie everything up in courts for years while his reputation is destroyed, his business collapses, and his victims finally get their day in public. Option 2, he pulled out a final document. He signs this. What is it? Vaughn asked hoarsely. A settlement. Palmer Technologies transfers to a trust managed by Sentinel Capital. The trust's primary purpose will be to compensate your victims. Every penny of profit you made from their suffering goes back to them. You personally declare bankruptcy, liquidate assets, and use the proceeds for additional victim compensation. That's everything, Vaughn said. My business, my money, this house. Everything you built on other people's broken dreams, yes. Fernando's voice was implacable. You'll also sign affidavits detailing your methods, which will be used to prevent future fraud. And you'll cooperate fully with federal regulators investigating similar schemes. And if I refuse, then I destroy you in court. Your victims sue you into oblivion anyway, and you likely face criminal charges for securities fraud. This way, at least you walk away alive if broke. Your victims get justice, and you don't spend the next decade in federal prison. The study was silent except for the ticking of an antique clock. Vaughn looked at the document, at Fernando, at Ashley, who was staring at him with dawning horror and betrayal. All those people, Ashley whispered. You really did that to them? The veteran, the bakery owner, all of them? Vaughn opened his mouth, closed it. What could he say? Denials were pointless now. The evidence was overwhelming. I need to think, he started. No, Fernando cut him off. You have until midnight tonight. After that, the offer expires and we proceed with option 1. Criminal referrals, public lawsuits, media exposure. Your choice. Greg placed a pen on the desk next to the document and stood. We'll be back at midnight for your answer. Chapter 7. Truth and Consequences. After Fernando and Greg left the study, Ashley remained behind with Vaughn. The house was quieter now. Most guests had departed, sensing the disaster unfolding. Through the door, she could hear her mother's muffled crying in the kitchen. Tell me it's not true, Ashley said. Tell me he's lying. Vaughn slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him. For 3 years, he played the role of successful entrepreneur, loving stepfather, better replacement for Fernando Wallace. Now the mask was cracking. It's more complicated than he made it sound. Vaughn tried. Is it? Ashley's voice shook. Did you or did you not steal from those people? I didn't steal. I followed contracts. Contracts you designed to trap them. She was shouting now, years of suppressed emotion breaking through. I heard those recordings. That woman crying about her grandmother's bakery. The veteran who lost his invention. You did that. Vaughn looked away. Business is brutal, Ashley. Your father knows that. He's just as ruthless. Look at what he's doing to me. To stop you from hurting more people. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Oh my God, he's not the villain here. He never was. In the kitchen, Deirdre had regained some composure. Helene sat across from her, a cup of tea untouched between them. I suppose you're going to say you told me so, Deirdre said bitterly. Would it help? Helene asked gently. No. Deirdre's hands trembled. I thought I was trading up. Fernando was so predictable, working all the time, never spontaneous. Vaughn was exciting, successful. Fernando was working to provide for you, and he was successful. You just didn't appreciate the quiet kind of success. Helene's voice held no judgment, only sadness. I watched you spend 3 years poisoning Ashley against her father. Why, Deirdre? Even after the divorce. Why turn her against him? Because Deirdre struggled with the truth. Because I needed to believe I made the right choice. If Fernando wasn't the bad guy, then I was just a woman who got bored and blew up her family for excitement. That's exactly what you were, Helene said softly. And you dragged Ashley down with you. Outside, in his car parked down the street, Fernando sat with his head against the steering wheel. Greg was beside him, respectfully silent. You did it, Greg finally said. Everything you planned, it all worked. Then why do I feel like this? Fernando's voice was raw. Because she's your daughter, and you just destroyed her world to save her from it. She hates me, Greg. Did you see her face? She's confused, angry. But Fernando, you did the right thing. Vaughn Palmer would have continued destroying lives. And Ashley needed to know the truth. Fernando pulled out his phone and looked at old photos. Ashley is a toddler, missing her front teeth and grinning at him. Ashley at her high school graduation. Ashley laughing at a bad joke he'd made at her 16th birthday party. In every photo, she was looking at him with trust and love. I used to be her hero, he whispered. Now I'm just the man who ruined Christmas. Give her time, Greg advised. The truth is harsh, but it's still the truth. By 11:30 p.m., the Palmer house was nearly empty. Ashley had locked herself in her room. Deirdre sat in the darkened living room, Christmas lights blinking mockingly around her. Vaughn was in his study, the settlement document in front of him, a glass of scotch in his hand. He'd tried calling lawyers, but it was Christmas night, and besides, Fernando Wallace had been thorough. Every angle was covered, every exit blocked. The only way out was through bankruptcy and shame, whether he signed the settlement or fought it in court. The difference was whether his victims got justice now or later. Vaughn thought about the people he destroyed. He'd never known their names before. They were just deals, just opportunities, just moves in a game he'd been winning. Earl Leach, the water purification inventor. Sarah Chun, the bakery owner. Michael Brennan, the veteran. 12 names, 12 lives, now looking at him from the pages of depositions and legal affidavits. He told himself it was just business, that they should have been smarter, read contracts more carefully, not been so desperate. But the recordings Fernando had played echoed in his mind. The woman crying about her grandmother's legacy. The veteran's voice breaking as he described losing his purpose. Vaughn Palmer had never thought of himself as a villain. Villains were obvious. Criminals, fraudsters, people who broke laws. He'd stayed legal. That made him smart, not evil. Didn't it? At 11:59 p.m., the doorbell rang. Vaughn opened it to find Fernando and Greg standing in the snow, briefcases in hand. Decision time, Fernando said. Chapter 8. The Price of Pride. They sat in Vaughn's study again, but this time the dynamic had shifted completely. Vaughn Palmer, who'd spent years as the predator, now understood what it felt like to be prey. I'll sign, he said quietly, on one condition. Fernando raised an eyebrow. You're not in a position to negotiate. Not a negotiation. A question. Vaughn looked directly at Fernando. Is this about justice for your victims or revenge for taking your wife? The question hung in the air. Greg shifted uncomfortably, but Fernando's expression remained neutral. Does it matter? Fernando finally asked. It matters to me. Fernando stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered estate. You want honesty? Fine. When I first discovered what you'd done to those 12 people, I was going to expose you immediately. Call regulators, tip off journalists, destroy you fast and public. He turned back to Vaughn. Then I found out you'd married my ex-wife and turned my daughter against me. That's when I decided to take my time. Make it personal. Ensure you understood exactly who was destroying you and why. So, it is revenge. Revenge would be ruining you for taking Deirdre. I couldn't care less about Deirdre. She showed her true colors when she chose a man like you. Fernando's voice hardened. This is about Ashley. You didn't just marry her mother. You systematically poisoned her against me. Used the same manipulation tactics you use in business. Made her believe I was the problem in their lives. She needed a father figure. She had a father. For the first time, Fernando's control cracked completely. I was there for 23 years. Every school play, every soccer game, every late night when she was scared of the dark. I worked 60-hour weeks to give her opportunities you're now enjoying in this house I'm about to take from you. The raw emotion in Fernando's voice seemed to shake the room. Even Greg looked surprised. He'd never seen his partner this unguarded. You want to know if this is justice or revenge? Fernando continued. It's both. Those 12 victims deserve compensation. But yes, I enjoyed every second of watching you squirm. I enjoyed buying your debt. I enjoyed that moment when you opened the door and realized exactly who I was. He leaned forward. You took my daughter from me, Vaughn. You don't get to judge how I take her back. Vaughn absorbed this, then slowly reached for the pen. What about Deirdre? What about her? This settlement ruins me, but she'll suffer too. No house, no lifestyle. She made her choice, Fernando said coldly. She chose excitement over stability, flash over substance. She can live with the consequences. She's still Ashley's mother, and Ashley is still my daughter, which is the only reason I'm not pursuing criminal charges against you personally." Fernando's voice dropped to a whisper. "Sign the document, Vaughn. Give those people you destroyed some measure of justice. It's the only decent thing you'll ever do." Vaughn signed. As Greg witnessed and notarized the document, Ashley appeared in the doorway. She'd been listening from the hallway, tears streaming down her face. "Dad," she said quietly. Fernando looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time in 3 years without a wall of lies between them. "Hey, Pumpkin." It was his old nickname for her from when she was 5 years old and insisted on carving jack-o'-lanterns in July. The familiar term broke something in Ashley, and she crossed the room to hug him, sobbing into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry I believed them. I'm so sorry I pushed you away." Fernando held his daughter tight, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "It's not your fault, Ashley. You were manipulated by an expert. I should have known, should have questioned. You were 20 when they got married. Your mother is persuasive." And Vaughn, he looked over Ashley's head at the broken man signing away his empire. "Vaughn is very good at making people believe what he wants them to believe." "Those people he hurt," Ashley whispered. "The recordings you played. Did that really happen?" "Every word true. 12 families. 1 suicide. That's who you've been living with, Ashley." She pulled back, looking at her father with new eyes. "You saved them. With this settlement, they'll get their money back, right?" "As much as possible, yes. It won't undo the damage, but it's something." Ashley looked at Vaughn, who was staring at the signed document like it was his death warrant. "I thought you were a good person," she said to him. "I thought you cared about me and Mom." Vaughn met her eyes. "I do care. That part wasn't fake. But everything else was." Ashley's voice was hard. "You used us. Made us weapons against my father. I bet you were terrified he'd figure out who you really were. So you kept us away from him. Made sure I'd never listen to anything he said." Vaughn didn't deny it. What was the point? Deirdre appeared behind Ashley, her face streaked with mascara. "What happens now?" Fernando looked at his ex-wife without pity. "Now Vaughn transfers his business to a trust that will compensate his victims. This house and everything in it will be sold to satisfy his debts. You'll need to find somewhere else to live." "Where am I supposed to go?" Deirdre's voice was brittle. "That's not my problem anymore. You left me for a life of excitement and luxury. Consider this your finale." He softened slightly. "I'm not heartless, Deirdre. You can stay in the house for 30 days while you figure things out. But after that, it goes on the market." "Generous," she said bitterly. "More generous than you ever were me." Chapter 9. The morning after. Christmas morning, the second one really, since midnight had passed, dawned cold and clear. Fernando sat in his downtown apartment, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. His phone was silent. The revenge he'd planned so carefully was complete, but victory tasted more bitter than he'd expected. Around 10 a.m., his doorbell rang. Fernando opened it to find Ashley standing there, a small overnight bag at her feet. "Can I stay here for a few days?" she asked. "I can't be in that house right now." Fernando pulled her into a hug. "You can stay as long as you want." They spent the day talking, really talking, for the first time in 3 years. Ashley asked questions Fernando answered honestly, about the divorce, about Deirdre's accusations of emotional unavailability, about the loneliness of the past 3 years watching his daughter from a distance. "I thought you didn't care," Ashley admitted. "Mom said you were always working, that you chose your job over us." "I was building a future for you," Fernando said. "Maybe I should have been home more. Maybe I wasn't perfect. But I never stopped loving you, Ashley. Not for 1 second. Why didn't you fight harder? When Mom turned me against you, why didn't you? What was I supposed to do? Storm into your life and demand you love me? Drag you to court and force visitation?" Fernando shook his head. "I couldn't force you to have a relationship with me. It had to be your choice. I just hoped that someday you'd see the truth." "Did you plan all this?" Ashley asked. "The Sentinel investment, buying Vaughn's debts, showing up at Christmas. Was it all calculated?" "Yes," Fernando admitted. "I'm not going to lie to you, Ashley. When I found out Vaughn Palmer was the man who married your mother and turned you against me, something in me snapped. I could have exposed him immediately, but I wanted him to suffer. I wanted him to lose everything the way he'd made others lose everything. And yes, I wanted you to see him for what he really was. That's cold, Dak. I know. Fernando met her eyes. I'm not proud of the revenge part, but I am proud that 12 families will get justice. That Von Palmer won't destroy anyone else. And I'm grateful that you're here now, willing to listen to my side of the story. Ashley was quiet for a long moment. Grandma Helene always said you were a good man. That mom was making a mistake. I didn't want to believe her. Your grandmother is wise. What about Mom? What happens to her now? Fernando considered the question. That depends on your mother. She made her choices. She can either learn from them or spend the rest of her life blaming everyone else. He paused. I don't hate Deirdre, Ashley. I did once, right after the divorce. But now I just feel nothing. She's your mother, so she'll always be in your life. But she's not my concern anymore. She's devastated. I'm sure she is. Her glamorous life just collapsed. But Ashley, your mother left me because I was boring. Because I didn't provide enough excitement. She chose a man who hurt people for profit because he had a yacht and drove a Tesla. Those were her values, not mine. She used to be different, Ashley said softly. I remember when I was little, she was kinder, gentler. People change. Sometimes they become better versions of themselves. Sometimes worse. Your mother chose worse. Over the next few days, the story broke publicly. 12 victims of Von Palmer's predatory practices filed a class action lawsuit with statements, evidence, and Fernando's Sentinel Capital backing their legal fees. The local news ran a devastating expose. Federal regulators opened an investigation. Von Palmer's empire collapsed in 72 hours. Earl Leach called Fernando personally. Mr. Wallace, I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me, Earl. Just rebuild your life. That's thanks enough. The settlement means I can pay off my debts. Maybe even start over with a new invention. Earl's voice cracked. You gave me hope again. You deserve justice. All of you did. One by one, the other victims called or emailed. Their gratitude was overwhelming, and it softened the bitter edge of Fernando's victory. Maybe he'd been motivated by revenge, but the result was still justice. On New Year's Eve, Ashley and Fernando stood on his apartment balcony, watching fireworks over the city. Deirdre had moved in with her parents, bitter and diminished. Vaughn had filed for bankruptcy and was cooperating with investigators, likely to avoid criminal charges. What's your New Year's resolution? Ashley asked. To be a better father to you, Fernando said immediately. You're already a good father. I just couldn't see it. She squeezed his hand. My resolution is to never let anyone manipulate me against the people I love. To trust my own judgment instead of listening to lies. That's a good one. Dad, Ashley's voice was tentative. The way you took down Vaughn. It was brutal, calculated, even a little scary. I know, but it was also kind of amazing. You're like Batman. A little dark, but ultimately fighting for good. She smiled slightly. My dad, the vigilante CFO. Fernando laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. I'm not Batman, pumpkin. No, you're better. You're real. As fireworks exploded overhead, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Fernando Wallace felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Peace. His daughter was back in his life. His enemies had faced consequences. The victims had received justice. It had cost him his marriage, 3 years of loneliness, and perhaps a piece of his soul. But looking at Ashley's face, finally free of manipulation and lies, he knew it had been worth it. Revenge, as it turned out, was sweetest when mixed with justice. And family, real family, built on truth instead of lies, was worth fighting for. Even if it meant becoming the villain in someone else's story to be the hero in his daughter's. Behind them, inside the apartment, Fernando's phone buzzed with a message from Greg Forbes. Palmer officially declared bankruptcy. All victims approved the trust distribution. You did good, partner. Fernando typed back. We did good. Then he put his phone away and focused on his daughter, on the fireworks, on the new year stretching before them, full of possibility and truth. The past was finally, truly behind him. And the future? For the first time in years, it looked bright. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Man Behind the Curtain. Jonathan Hampton stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the Potomac River flow beneath the early morning mist. At 45, he had built an empire that few could comprehend. To the public, he was the CEO of Hampton Strategic Consulting, a firm that advised Fortune 500 companies on crisis management. To those who mattered in Washington, he was something far more valuable, the man who knew where every skeleton was buried. His journey to power hadn't been conventional. Born to a single mother in rural Virginia, Jonathan had clawed his way through Georgetown law on scholarships and sheer determination. His first job at the Pentagon as a junior analyst had opened doors most never knew existed. While others focused on climbing corporate ladders, Jonathan mapped the invisible networks that really controlled America. He cultivated relationships with senators, chiefs of staff, befriended the right people in intelligence agencies, and slowly built a web of influence that stretched from Capitol Hill to Langley. The irony wasn't lost on him that his success had attracted Carolina Miranda, a stunning political science professor at Georgetown. When they met at a diplomatic function 8 years ago, her beauty had captivated him, but it was her sharp intellect and ambition that sealed his interest. Carolina came from old money. Her father, Ambassador Ricardo Miranda, had served in 3 administrations. She understood power, or so Jonathan had thought. Their marriage had been a merger of sorts. Carolina brought social connections and legitimacy to Jonathan's wealth, while he provided her the resources to pursue her own ambitions. She transitioned from academia to consulting, eventually landing a position with the State Department's Foreign Policy Advisory Board. But lately, something had shifted. Jonathan's instincts, honed by years of reading people and situations, sensed danger in his own home. Carolina had become distant, taking mysterious phone calls and making unexplained trips. Her laptop, once carelessly left open, was now password protected. Most tellingly, she'd started asking subtle questions about his work, questions that went beyond spousal curiosity. Jonathan's phone buzzed. Vincent Benjamin, his head of security and former Delta Force operator, appeared on the caller ID. "Sir, we've completed the surveillance sweep you requested. You need to see this immediately. My office. 10 minutes. Vincent arrived with a tablet containing weeks of compiled intelligence. The photographs made Jonathan's blood run cold. Carolina entering a hotel with Colonel Eric Lester from the Pentagon's Strategic Operations Division. The same hotel, multiple times, over 3 months. But the audio recordings were what transformed Jonathan's suspicion into cold, calculated fury. Jonathan suspects nothing. Carolina's voice was crystal clear through the recording device Vincent had planted in her car. He's so focused on his precious clients that he doesn't see what's happening right under his nose. Eric's voice responded, "The plan is solid, Carolina. My contacts in military intelligence are ready to move. Once we have concrete evidence of his illegal surveillance operations, we can bring him down. You'll get everything in the divorce, and I'll get the promotion I've been promised for exposing a national security threat." Jonathan set the tablet down carefully, his expression never changing. Vincent had worked with him long enough to recognize the deadly calm that preceded Jonathan's most ruthless decisions. "How long have you known?" Vincent asked. "I suspected for weeks." "You've confirmed it." Jonathan walked to his safe, retrieving a file that few people knew existed. "Carolina thinks she's hunting a wolf. She's about to learn she's been living with a dragon." The file contained information that could topple governments, recordings of senators discussing illegal campaign contributions, photographs of federal judges in compromising positions, evidence of CIA operations that violated international law. This wasn't just leverage, it was nuclear-grade political ammunition. "What's the play, boss?" Vincent asked. Jonathan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Let them think they're winning. Eric Lester wants to play with the big boys? Let's see how he handles the real game. Chapter 2. The Colonel's Gambit. Colonel Eric Lester sat in his Pentagon office, reviewing the fabricated intelligence reports that would soon destroy Jonathan Hampton. At 38, Eric had spent 15 years building his military career with one goal: achieving the star of a general before 40. The problem was that legitimate advancement took too long, and Eric's patience had run out. His relationship with Carolina had started innocently enough. They'd met at a Defense Department reception where she was consulting on a foreign policy initiative. Eric had been immediately drawn to her sophistication and insider knowledge of Washington's power structures. When he learned she was married to Jonathan Hampton, his interest became strategic. Eric had heard whispers about Hampton's real business for years. Intelligence officers talked in hushed tones about the consultant who somehow knew classified information before it was classified. Some called him a patriot who helped prevent security breaches. Others labeled him a dangerous information broker who operated outside legal boundaries. Carolina had been surprisingly receptive to his advances. During their affair, she'd revealed intimate details about Jonathan's operations, his network of informants, his methods for gathering intelligence, and most importantly, his weaknesses. Eric realized he'd found his ticket to the general's star he coveted. "The evidence is compelling, sir," Eric told Brigadier General Raymond Singleton during their weekly briefing. "Hampton's company has been conducting illegal surveillance operations against federal officials. We have testimony from his wife confirming his activities." General Singleton, a by-the-book officer who'd risen through legitimate channels, frowned at the report. "This is serious, Colonel. If Hampton is truly compromising national security, we need to act decisively. I recommend we coordinate with military police for immediate detention," Eric suggested. "Given the sensitivity, we should handle this internally before involving civilian authorities." What Eric didn't know was that General Singleton had served with Vincent Benjamin in Iraq. A casual mention of Hampton's name had prompted Singleton to make a discreet phone call. The general now knew exactly who Eric Lester really was, and who he was truly working against. Meanwhile, Carolina was playing her own dangerous game. In her Georgetown townhouse, she met with Wendell Jacobs, an ambitious defense contractor who'd promised her wealth beyond imagination once Jonathan was eliminated as a competitor. "Eric is moving tomorrow," Carolina told Jacobs. "The military police will arrest Jonathan on treason charges. Once he's detained, I'll have access to his files. We can expose his entire network and claim we were working undercover to stop him." Jacobs smiled. "And I'll be perfectly positioned to acquire his most valuable contracts. Your husband built quite an empire, Carolina. Shame he won't be around to enjoy it." What neither Carolina nor Jacobs realized was that Jonathan had been feeding them information for weeks. Every document they thought they'd stolen, every recording they believed was evidence of his crimes, had been carefully crafted to lead them exactly where Jonathan wanted them to go. In a secure facility outside Washington, Jonathan's real files remained untouched. His actual network of informants continued their work, unaware that their identities had never been compromised. Most importantly, his most dangerous secrets, the kind that could topple governments, remained safely hidden. As Carolina celebrated what she believed was her husband's impending downfall, Jonathan was 3 moves ahead, orchestrating a game of chess where his opponents didn't even realize they were pawns. Chapter 3. The Web Titans. The morning of what Carolina believed would be Jonathan's arrest began like any other. Jonathan kissed her goodbye at their Potomac mansion, his demeanor giving no hint of the storm about to break. He'd studied his wife's betrayal like a military campaign, mapping every alliance and weakness until he understood the full scope of her treachery. The revelation that had hurt most wasn't the affair. Jonathan's emotional investment in their marriage had died months ago. It was the discovery that Carolina had been feeding information to Wendell Jacobs for over a year, information that had cost Jonathan 3 major contracts and nearly exposed 2 of his most valuable sources. Her betrayal wasn't just personal. It was potentially catastrophic to people who trusted him with their lives. At Hampton Strategic Consulting, Jonathan convened an emergency meeting with his inner circle. Besides Vincent Benjamin, the group included Trudy Hill, his chief financial officer and former NSA analyst, and Philip Brewer, his legal counsel who'd previously served as a federal prosecutor. "Today's the day they make their move," Jonathan announced. "Eric has convinced his superiors to authorize my arrest. Carolina believes she'll inherit my empire. Jacobs thinks he'll acquire my government contracts." Trudy pulled up financial records on her laptop. "We've traced the money trail. Jacobs has been funneling payments to Eric through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. The affair was purely transactional. Carolina gets half your assets in the divorce. Eric gets his general star for exposing you, and Jacobs eliminates his biggest competitor." Philip reviewed legal documents. "The treason charges are based on fabricated evidence, but they'll hold long enough to freeze your assets and destroy your reputation. In the short term, they'll achieve their goals." Jonathan walked to a wall-mounted screen displaying a complex organizational chart. "They've made one critical error. They assumed I've been operating illegally all these years." He touched the screen, revealing a second layer of information. "Every source, every operation, every piece of intelligence I've gathered has been conducted under proper legal authority." The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Vincent was the first to understand. "You're not just a consultant. You've been working directly for." "The Deputy Director of National Intelligence has been my handler for 8 years, Jonathan confirmed. "Every foreign contact I've cultivated, every piece of classified information I've accessed, every operation I've conducted has been sanctioned at the highest levels. My criminal enterprise is actually one of the government's most successful human intelligence operations." Trudy whistled softly. "So, when they arrest you for treason, they'll be arresting a decorated intelligence asset," Philip finished. "The political fallout will be spectacular." Jonathan's phone rang. The caller ID showed a Pentagon number. "Mr. Hampton, this is Master Sergeant Chuck Brooks with the 519th Military Police Battalion. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of treason against the United States. Please report to our facility immediately for processing." "I'll be there within the hour, Sergeant," Jonathan replied calmly. After ending the call, he turned to his team. "Phase 1 begins now. Trudy, initiate the Prometheus protocol. Philip, prepare the legal counterstrike. Vincent, you know what to do." As Jonathan prepared for his arrest, Carolina was already celebrating at the Four Seasons with Eric and Jacobs. She'd filed divorce papers that morning, confident that her husband would soon be too disgraced to fight her in court. To new beginnings, Jacobs toasted, raising his champagne glass. "To justice," Eric added, checking his phone for updates on Jonathan's arrest. Carolina smiled, imagining the look on Jonathan's face when the handcuffs clicked into place. She had no idea that her husband had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment, or that her celebration was about to become a funeral for her own ambitions. At 3:47 p.m., as military police escorted Jonathan Hampton into their facility, the most elaborate revenge in Washington's history began to unfold. Chapter 4. The phone call that changed everything. The military police station buzzed with nervous energy as news of Jonathan Hampton's arrest spread through the Pentagon. Colonel Eric Lester paced in his office, waiting for confirmation that his plan had succeeded. This was supposed to be his moment of triumph, the operation that would secure his promotion and eliminate the man who'd unknowingly stood in his way for years. In the interrogation room, Jonathan sat calmly across from Master Sergeant Chuck Brooks and Captain Angel Bautista, the investigating officers assigned to his case. His composure unnerved them. Most people facing treason charges showed at least some anxiety. "Mr. Hampton," Captain Bautista began, "your wife has provided testimony alleging that you've been conducting illegal surveillance operations against federal officials. She claims to have evidence of your activities." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. "Carolina has indeed been very thorough in her documentation. Tell me, Captain, has Colonel Lester briefed you on the full scope of these allegations?" The officers exchanged glances. Sergeant Brooks consulted his notes. "Colonel Lester provided the initial intelligence that led to this investigation. Are you claiming his information is inaccurate?" "Not inaccurate," Jonathan replied. "Incomplete. Very incomplete. He leaned back in his chair. "I'd like to make my phone call now." Captain Bautista gestured toward the phone on the wall. "You're entitled to contact an attorney." "Who are you calling?" Jonathan's answer made both officers freeze. "The White House." Sergeant Brooks laughed nervously. "Sir, this isn't a movie. You can't just call the White House." Jonathan calmly dialed a number from memory. After 2 rings, a professional voice answered. "White House Situation Room. This is Barry Howell." "Barry, this is Jonathan Hampton. Authorization code Raven 77 Echo. I need to speak with Deputy Chief of Staff Cassandra Livingston immediately." "Jonathan? Jesus, what's your situation?" "I'm currently detained by military police on fabricated treason charges. Someone's been feeding them disinformation about my operations." "Stand by." The line went quiet for 30 seconds while the officers stared at Jonathan in growing disbelief. When the voice returned, it carried the unmistakable authority of the executive office. "Jonathan, this is Cassandra. We're tracking your situation in real time. Are you injured?" "Negative, but we have a significant security breach. The operation has been compromised by hostile actors within the Pentagon and civilian sectors." "Understood. Executive protection protocols are now in effect. Expect immediate intervention." Jonathan hung up and turned to the stunned officers. "Gentlemen, you might want to call your commanding officer. This situation is about to escalate rapidly." Less than an hour later, Leonard Adams, the Deputy Chief of Staff, arrived at the military police facility accompanied by 2 Secret Service agents and a Deputy Attorney General. Behind him walked General Raymond Singleton, whose expression made it clear that someone was about to face severe consequences. "Release Mr. Hampton immediately," Adams ordered. "This detention is unauthorized and potentially compromises ongoing national security operations." Captain Bautista stammered, "Sir, we have orders from Colonel Lester based on intelligence from—" "Colonel Lester," General Singleton interrupted, "has been relieved of duty pending investigation for abuse of authority and possible treason." "Where is he now?" While chaos erupted at the military police facility, Carolina received a panic call from Eric. "They're not just releasing him." Eric's voice shook with fear. The White House intervened directly. "Carolina, what the hell have we done?" "That's impossible," Carolina protested, but doubt was already creeping into her voice. "Jonathan is just a consultant. He doesn't have those kinds of connections. The Deputy Chief of Staff is here personally. They're talking about charging me with treason." "Carolina, I think we've made a terrible mistake." Meanwhile, Wendell Jacobs was discovering that his triumph had turned to disaster. Federal agents had simultaneously raided his offices and frozen his assets. The shell company he'd used to pay Eric had been under surveillance for months, and every financial transaction was now evidence in a federal conspiracy case. As Jonathan walked out of the military police facility as a free man, he placed a call to Vincent Benjamin. "Phase 2 is a go," he said simply. The trap hadn't just been sprung, it had been perfectly executed. Carolina, Eric, and Jacobs had revealed the full extent of their conspiracy, provided evidence of their crimes, and eliminated any possibility of claiming innocence. But Jonathan's revenge was just beginning. Chapter 5: The Unraveling. The Georgetown townhouse that Carolina Miranda Hampton had inherited from her father felt like a prison as she paced frantically through its elegant rooms. 24 hours after Jonathan's release, her world was collapsing with terrifying speed. The divorce papers she'd filed so confidently were now meaningless. Federal authorities had frozen all marital assets, pending investigation of her involvement in what they were calling a complex conspiracy against national security. Her phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, lawyers, and former friends distancing themselves from the growing scandal. The most devastating call came from her father's former colleague, Ambassador Fernando McNeil. "Carolina, your father is rolling in his grave." McNeil's voice was cold with disgust. The Miranda name stood for honor and service to this country for 3 generations. "What you've done, it's unconscionable." "I didn't know," Carolina protested weakly. "Jonathan never told me he was working for the government." "Of course he didn't. That's what classified means, you foolish girl." Did you really think a man with his connections was operating outside the law? The truth was, Carolina had never bothered to consider the full implications of her husband's power. She'd been so focused on what she saw as his vulnerabilities that she'd missed the obvious signs of his true authority. The late-night calls from unnamed officials, the deference shown to him by people who typically defer to no one, the way investigations that might have touched his business mysteriously redirected elsewhere. It all made terrible sense now. At the Federal Detention Center, Eric Lester sat in his cell, contemplating the destruction of everything he'd worked to achieve. His military career was over, his pension gone, and criminal charges were being prepared that could result in life in prison. The general star he coveted so desperately now seemed like a cruel joke. His cellmate, a drug dealer named Calvin Hancock, found Eric's situation amusing. "Man, you really thought you could take down someone connected to the White House? That's some serious stupid right there." Eric's lawyer, a public defender named Marcia Groves, had delivered even worse news during their meeting. "The government has recordings of every conversation you had with Mrs. Hampton and Mr. Jacobs. They know about the Swiss bank account, the Cayman Islands shell company, even the vacation you took to Dubai last month. They've been watching this conspiracy unfold from the beginning." "That's impossible," Eric insisted. "We were careful. Mr. Lester, they were feeding you information. Every document you thought you'd stolen, every piece of evidence you believed exposed Mr. Hampton's illegal activities. It was all fabricated and provided to you deliberately. You weren't investigating a criminal. You were being manipulated by a master strategist." The revelation that Jonathan had orchestrated every aspect of their conspiracy sent Eric into a despair deeper than anything he'd experienced in combat. He'd been a decorated officer, a leader of men, a professional soldier, and he'd been played like an amateur by a civilian consultant. Meanwhile, Wendell Jacobs was learning that his corporate empire had been built on foundations of sand. Federal auditors had descended on his company like locusts, and they were discovering that many of his most profitable government contracts had been obtained through the very information Carolina had stolen from Jonathan. The fraud charges alone could result in decades in prison, but the national security implications meant he was looking at potential life sentences. His wife, Shannon Gilmore Jacobs, had already filed for divorce and moved their children to her parents' home in California. His business partners were turning state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences. His lawyers were suggesting plea bargains that would still leave him imprisoned until his 70s. From his penthouse office, Jonathan watched the destruction he'd orchestrated with the same calm efficiency he'd applied to its planning. Vincent Benjamin brought him regular updates on the investigation's progress. "Eric's military tribunal is scheduled for next month," Vincent reported. "He's looking at charges of conspiracy, treason, theft of classified information, and financial crimes. His lawyer's trying to negotiate a plea, but the military prosecutors aren't interested. And Jacobs, federal prosecutors are considering him a flight risk. His passport's been revoked, and there's talk of moving him to a maximum security facility. The Financial Crimes Unit says they've never seen a conspiracy this extensive involving defense contracts." Jonathan nodded. "What about Carolina?" "That's where it gets interesting," Vincent smiled grimly. "She's not just facing charges related to the conspiracy. The Justice Department has been investigating her consulting work, and they've discovered she's been selling classified information to foreign contacts for over 2 years. Information she accessed through your security clearance." The final betrayal was worse than Jonathan had imagined. Carolina hadn't just been unfaithful and greedy. She'd been a traitor, using their marriage to compromise national security for personal profit. The woman he'd loved had been systematically destroying everything he'd built while selling out her own country. Jonathan walked to his window, watching the Potomac flow beneath the setting sun. The first phase of his revenge was complete. His enemies were exposed, arrested, and facing the full weight of the federal justice system. But true retribution required more than legal consequences. It required personal destruction. Chapter 6: The Point of No Return. The secure conference room in the federal building hummed with tension as U.S. Attorney Olivia Solomon outlined the government's case against the conspiracy. Present were representatives from the Justice Department, Pentagon, National Security Agency, and Jonathan Hampton himself, now officially acknowledged as a deep-cover intelligence asset. The scope of this betrayal is unprecedented, Solomon announced, gesturing to charts covering the walls. Mrs. Hampton didn't just compromise her husband's operations. She sold classified intelligence to representatives of 3 hostile foreign governments. Colonel Lester wasn't just committing financial crimes. He was systematically exposing military personnel in classified positions. Mr. Jacobs wasn't just engaging in contract fraud. He was using stolen intelligence to underbid legitimate defense contractors by billions of dollars. Jonathan studied the evidence with professional detachment. Audio recordings of Carolina meeting with Chinese intelligence operatives. Financial records showing Eric had been feeding information to Russian contacts for 18 months. Documentation proving Jacobs had been selling classified defense technologies to Iranian proxies through shell companies. The betrayal was more comprehensive than even Jonathan had suspected. His wife hadn't just been unfaithful. She'd been a full-scale foreign asset using their marriage as cover for espionage. Eric wasn't just a corrupt officer seeking advancement. He was a traitor who'd compromised dozens of undercover operatives. Jacobs wasn't merely a greedy businessman. He was facilitating the transfer of military secrets to America's enemies. Mr. Hampton, Solomon continued, given the classified nature of your work, we can't try this case in open court. However, we can ensure that justice is served through military tribunals and federal security courts. Jonathan nodded slowly. I appreciate the government's position, but I have a different concern. These individuals didn't just commit crimes against the state, they violated personal trust in ways that demand personal consequences. The room fell silent. Everyone present understood that Jonathan Hampton wasn't just a betrayed husband or a compromised intelligence asset. He was a man with the connections and resources to ensure that justice extended far beyond what any court could provide. Deputy Attorney General Andre Petty leaned forward. Mr. Hampton, while we understand your personal investment in this case, we can't sanction any extrajudicial activities. Of course not, Jonathan replied with a slight smile. I wouldn't dream of asking for official sanction. After the meeting, Jonathan drove to the maximum security facility where Carolina was being held pending trial. The woman who greeted him in the visitor's room bore little resemblance to the sophisticated beauty he'd married. Her designer clothes had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit. Her perfectly styled hair hung limp around her face, and her eyes showed the haunted look of someone whose world had completely collapsed. Hello, Carolina, Jonathan said calmly, sitting across from her at the metal table. Jonathan, she whispered, unable to meet his eyes. I didn't know they would. Stop. His voice was quiet but carried such authority that Carolina immediately fell silent. Don't insult my intelligence with lies. I know about Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran. I know about the Swiss accounts and the numbered companies. I know you've been a foreign asset since before we married. Carolina's face went white. The scope of her exposure was clearly worse than she'd imagined. I came here to tell you something important, Jonathan continued. The federal prosecutors think life in prison is sufficient punishment for treason. They're wrong. What do you mean? Carolina's voice shook. Jonathan leaned closer, his eyes showing no trace of the man who'd once professed to love her. You sold classified information that got people killed, Carolina. Agents in the field, assets we'd cultivated for years, operatives with families who trusted that their identities were secure. You murdered them for money. I never meant for anyone to. You don't get to claim good intentions when you're counting blood money, Jonathan interrupted. The courts will give you a cage for the rest of your life. I'm going to give you something worse. Carolina stared at him in growing terror. What are you going to do? Jonathan stood to leave. I'm going to make sure that every person who dies because of your betrayal has a family member who knows exactly who you are and what you did. Every widow, every orphan child, every parent who lost a son or daughter because of your greed. They'll know your name, your face, and exactly how to find you. You can't do that, Carolina protested desperately. I'll be in protective custody. Prison has its own justice system, Carolina, and money talks in every language. Jonathan's smile was cold enough to freeze blood. You wanted to destroy my life for profit. Now you'll spend what's left of yours looking over your shoulder, wondering which guard has been paid to look the other way, which inmate has a dead relative to avenge, which meal might be your last. As Jonathan walked away, Carolina's screams echoed through the visitor's room. For the first time since her arrest, she truly understood the scope of what she'd unleashed. She'd betrayed a man who didn't just have power. She betrayed a man who understood how to use it without limits or mercy. The game was no longer about legal justice. It was about survival, and Carolina was beginning to realize she was about to lose that too. Chapter 7. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. 6 months after the arrests, the federal trials had concluded with devastating efficiency. Eric Lester had been sentenced to life in military prison without possibility of parole after a tribunal convicted him of treason, espionage, and conspiracy. Wendell Jacobs received concurrent life sentences in federal court for his role in selling defense secrets to foreign governments. Carolina faced the same fate, with her trial scheduled for the following month. But Jonathan Hampton's revenge was far from complete. From his rebuilt offices, the investigation had cleared him of all wrongdoing and restored his security clearances. Jonathan orchestrated a campaign of systematic destruction that reached far beyond simple legal consequences. His targets had taken everything from him: his trust, his marriage, his security, and most importantly, they'd gotten intelligence operatives killed. The courts could imprison them, but only Jonathan could ensure they truly paid for their crimes. Vincent Benjamin entered Jonathan's office with a tablet containing surveillance reports. Carolina's been moved to administrative segregation after the third incident. Someone got to her in the shower block last week. Anyone seriously hurt? Jonathan asked without looking up from his work. Minor injuries, mostly psychological damage. But word is spreading through the prison population about what she did. Turns out 2 of the women in her block lost brothers in Afghanistan. Operations that were compromised by intelligence she sold. Jonathan nodded. He'd quietly ensured that information about Carolina's betrayals reached the right ears within the federal prison system. Not through direct action. That would have been too traceable, but through careful manipulation of information networks that already existed. A leaked document here, a whispered conversation there, and suddenly Carolina's fellow inmates understood exactly why their sons and husbands had died in operations that should have been secure. What about Jacobs? Jonathan asked. Federal prison is harder to penetrate, but we've made progress. His former business partners have been sharing information about his activities with other inmates. Turns out defense contractors aren't popular with military veterans serving time for unrelated offenses. Wendell Jacobs was discovering that federal prison contained its own justice system. Men who'd lost friends to improvised explosive devices didn't take kindly to contractors who'd sold the technology to make those devices more effective. Guards who were military veterans themselves found it difficult to maintain professional protection for someone who betrayed their brothers in arms. But Eric Lester was experiencing the most comprehensive destruction. Military prisons operated by different rules, and Eric had violated the most sacred trust in the armed forces. His fellow inmates were all military personnel who'd committed various offenses, but treason was in a category by itself. The psychological warfare was methodical and relentless. Eric's cell was searched daily for security reasons, interrupting his sleep and preventing any sense of routine. His mail was delayed or lost by postal clerks who happened to be veterans of units he'd compromised. During exercise periods, other inmates would accidentally bump into him, whisper the names of dead operatives in his ear, or simply stare at him with undisguised hatred. Most devastating were the photographs that somehow found their way to him. Pictures of military funerals, of flag-draped coffins, of widows receiving folded flags from honor guards. Each photograph bore a simple note: "You did this." The psychological pressure was breaking him systematically. Eric had been a strong man, a decorated officer accustomed to stress and danger. But this wasn't combat. This was slow, methodical, psychological torture designed to destroy his sanity one piece at a time. Meanwhile, Jonathan was expanding his campaign beyond the primary conspirators. Every person who'd known about the plot and failed to stop it, every official who'd been compromised by the stolen intelligence, every business partner who'd benefited from Jacobs's illegal activities. All of them found their lives touched by consequences that seemed random but were actually precisely orchestrated. Senator William Curtis, who'd been receiving classified briefings from Carolina in exchange for favorable committee votes, suddenly found himself under ethics investigation. The evidence had appeared anonymously in the hands of investigative journalists, but the documentation was too detailed and accurate to ignore. Admiral Benjamin Allison, who'd been Eric's contact in naval intelligence, discovered that his involvement had been reported to the Pentagon Inspector General. His security clearance was suspended pending investigation, effectively ending his career 6 months before retirement. Defense contractor Aurora Hodge, who'd been laundering payments from Jacobs to various officials, learned that the IRS had received detailed financial records showing her participation in tax evasion schemes. Federal agents raided her home and offices simultaneously, seizing everything she'd built over 20 years in business. The pattern was clear to anyone looking carefully. Everyone who'd touched the conspiracy was being systematically destroyed. But the evidence of their destruction appeared to come through normal investigative channels, making it impossible to prove that Jonathan Hampton was orchestrating their downfall. From his office, Jonathan watched the news coverage of Senator Curtis's resignation with satisfaction. The reporter was discussing how new evidence had revealed a pattern of corruption that investigators were still unraveling. What the reporter didn't know was that Jonathan had spent years documenting every instance of corruption he'd encountered, building files that could destroy careers and lives with surgical precision. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Philip Brewer, his legal counsel. "Jonathan, we need to talk. The Justice Department wants to offer Carolina a plea bargain." "Declined." Jonathan responded immediately. "You haven't heard the terms yet." "I don't care about the terms, Philip. Carolina dies in prison, or she dies somewhere else. Those are the only 2 options." Philip was quiet for a moment. "Jonathan, I understand your anger, but—" "No, you don't," Jonathan interrupted. "You understand legal consequences. You understand justice as defined by courts and laws. What you don't understand is that some betrayals demand permanent consequences." After ending the call, Jonathan returned to his work. 3 more congressional staffers would find their careers destroyed by anonymous tips about their involvement in the conspiracy. 2 federal judges who'd been receiving classified information from Carolina would face impeachment proceedings. A dozen business executives who'd benefited from Jacobs's stolen intelligence would discover that their companies were now under federal investigation. The web of destruction was expanding methodically, touching everyone who'd participated in or profited from the betrayal of American intelligence operations. Jonathan's revenge wasn't just personal. It was institutional, designed to send a message that some lines could never be crossed without facing consequences that extended far beyond any courtroom. But the most important message was personal. Carolina, Eric, and Jacobs had believed they could destroy Jonathan Hampton and walk away with their profits and promotions. They were about to learn that some men, when betrayed completely, respond with a ruthlessness that makes survival impossible. Chapter 8. No Mercy for the Wicked. The letter arrived at Carolina's federal prison cell on a Tuesday morning, delivered through official channels but carrying an unofficial message that made her blood run cold. It contained a single photograph: her sister Antoinette Christensen being escorted from her Georgetown law office by federal agents. The accompanying news clipping explained that Antoinette was under investigation for money laundering related to the foreign intelligence payments Carolina had received. Carolina stared at the image with growing horror. Antoinette was innocent. She'd never been involved in any of Carolina's activities. But the evidence appeared devastating. Financial records showing regular payments from Antoinette's law firm to accounts Carolina had used for her espionage activities. Of course, those records were fabricated, but they would be impossible to disprove given the complexity of international financial transactions. A guard appeared at her cell door. "Hampton, you have a visitor." In the visiting room, Carolina found herself face-to-face with her sister for the first time since the arrests. Antoinette looked exhausted and terrified, her usually immaculate appearance replaced by the haggard look of someone whose life was collapsing. "Carolina, what have you done?" Antoinette's voice shook with barely controlled emotion. "They're saying I helped you launder money from foreign governments. They're threatening to seize my law practice, my home, everything I've worked for." "I never involved you in anything," Carolina protested. "You have to believe me, Antoinette. I kept my activities completely separate from family." "Then explain how my client accounts show payments to your offshore companies," Antoinette demanded, producing documents that Carolina recognized as genuine but impossible. "Explain how my law firm's computers contain encrypted communications with your foreign contacts." Carolina stared at the evidence with growing realization. Jonathan hadn't just destroyed her. He was systematically destroying everyone she cared about. The evidence against Antoinette was fabricated but sophisticated enough to withstand legal scrutiny. Her sister would spend years fighting charges that would bankrupt her even if she ultimately won. "He's doing this," Carolina whispered. "Jonathan is destroying you to hurt me." "Who is Jonathan Hampton?" Antoinette asked desperately. "Why would he do this to our family?" Carolina looked at her sister, brilliant, honest, dedicated to justice and law, and realized she could never explain the true scope of what she'd unleashed. How could she tell Antoinette that she'd betrayed her country for money? How could she explain that her greed had gotten intelligence operatives killed? How could she admit that her husband wasn't just a businessman, but a man with the power to destroy lives with surgical precision? "Stay away from me," Carolina said finally. "Don't visit, don't call, don't try to help me. Maybe if you distance yourself completely, he'll leave you alone." But even as she said it, Carolina knew it was too late. Jonathan's revenge was comprehensive and unforgiving. Anyone who'd benefited from her life, anyone who loved her, anyone who might provide her comfort in prison, they would all be systematically destroyed until she had nothing left but the horror of what she'd done. At the military prison, Eric Lester was experiencing his own family tragedy. His ex-wife Patricia Wilson had remarried and changed her name, hoping to escape the stigma of her association with a convicted traitor. But somehow, her new employer had discovered her connection to Eric. The private security firm where she worked required federal clearances, and employees with family ties to foreign intelligence assets were considered security risks. Patricia's termination had been swift and devastating. In the competitive world of security contracting, her association with Eric made her unemployable. She'd moved 3 times in 6 months, trying to find work under her maiden name, but the information always surfaced. Her new husband, a good man who'd married her despite her past, was beginning to strain under the financial and social pressure. Their children, Eric's stepchildren whom he'd helped raise, were suffering most of all. Classmates had discovered their family connection to the traitor colonel through internet searches and social media. They faced daily harassment at school, with teachers struggling to address bullying based on family connections to national security crimes. Eric received letters from Patricia begging him to somehow make the persecution stop. She didn't understand that her ex-husband was as powerless as she was against the systematic destruction being orchestrated against anyone connected to the conspiracy. Jonathan Hampton's revenge extended beyond the primary targets to encompass everyone who might provide them comfort or support. Meanwhile, Wendell Jacobs was learning that his children faced their own consequences. His son Juan Franklin Jacobs had been expelled from West Point when investigators discovered that his father had used stolen military intelligence to fund the boy's education. The honor code violations were clear. One had benefited from treasonous activities, making him unfit for military service. His daughter Lorna Houston Jacobs, a medical student at Johns Hopkins, found herself under investigation by the state medical board. Questions have been raised about whether her education had been funded through illegal activities, potentially disqualifying her from obtaining a medical license. The investigation would take years to resolve, effectively ending her medical career before it began. From his office, Jonathan reviewed updates on each family's destruction with the same methodical attention he'd once applied to protecting national security. The children were collateral damage, but necessary collateral damage. The message had to be absolute. Betraying Jonathan Hampton didn't just destroy the betrayer, it destroyed everyone they loved. Vincent Benjamin expressed concern about the scope of the campaign. "Sir, some of these people are genuinely innocent. The children had no knowledge of their parents' activities." Jonathan looked up from his files. "Vincent, how many children lost parents because of the intelligence Carolina sold? How many families were destroyed when Eric compromised undercover operations? How many wives became widows because Jacobs gave our enemies the technology to kill American soldiers more efficiently?" "Point taken, sir. Betrayal has consequences," Jonathan continued. "Not just for the betrayer, but for everyone connected to them. That's how trust works in our world. When you violate it, the penalty extends beyond just yourself." The phone rang with an update from his congressional sources. 3 more officials connected to the conspiracy had announced their resignations under pressure from ethics investigations. 2 federal judges were facing impeachment proceedings. A dozen defense contractors had lost their security clearances and government contracts. But the most important call came from the prison system itself. Carolina had been moved to solitary confinement after attempting suicide. Eric was under psychiatric observation after a complete mental breakdown. Jacobs had been hospitalized following a severe beating by fellow inmates who'd learned about his role in selling military secrets. "Sir," the caller reported, "all 3 primary targets are broken. Psychologically, physically, and financially destroyed. Their families are scattered and ruined. Everyone connected to the conspiracy has faced consequences. The message has been delivered." Jonathan hung up and walked to his window, watching the Potomac flow beneath the evening sky. Phase 3 of his revenge was complete. His enemies weren't just imprisoned. They were destroyed so thoroughly that their very existence served as a warning to others who might consider betraying him. But one final phase remained. The phase that would ensure this betrayal could never happen again. Chapter 9. The Dragon's Final Lesson. 1 year after the conspiracy's exposure, Jonathan Hampton stood in the Oval Office receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his extraordinary service to national security under circumstances that required personal sacrifice and exceptional courage. The president, flanked by the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Defense, spoke about Jonathan's contributions to preventing one of the most serious intelligence breaches in American history. What the public didn't know was that Jonathan had helped expose the conspiracy by allowing it to develop far enough to identify every participant, every foreign contact, and every compromised operation. His apparent victimization had been a carefully orchestrated intelligence operation that had rolled up enemy networks across 3 continents. Your willingness to endure personal betrayal for the sake of national security exemplifies the highest ideals of service, the president said as he placed the medal around Jonathan's neck. The intelligence gathered through this operation has prevented multiple terrorist attacks and exposed foreign agents operating at the highest levels of our government. After the ceremony, Jonathan returned to his expanded headquarters. Hampton Strategic Consulting had grown exponentially following the publicity of his government service. Companies and individuals who'd previously been skeptical of his methods now competed for his attention. More importantly, his reputation as someone who never forgot a betrayal and never forgave an enemy had reached the right ears throughout Washington's power structure. His inner circle had evolved as well. Trudy Hill had been promoted to deputy director, effectively running daily operations while Jonathan focused on strategic planning. Philip Brewer had transitioned from legal counsel to chief operating officer, overseeing the company's expansion into new markets. Vincent Benjamin continued to serve as head of security, but now commanded a team of former military and intelligence operatives who handled Jonathan's most sensitive requirements. The final status reports on his enemies made for satisfying reading. Carolina had been found dead in her prison cell 3 months earlier, officially ruled a suicide but understood by everyone involved to have been assisted by fellow inmates who'd lost family members to her betrayals. Her sister Antoinette had lost her law practice and declared bankruptcy, fighting charges that were eventually dropped, but only after her career and reputation were completely destroyed. Eric Lester remained in military prison, but his mind had been broken by the systematic psychological pressure and the knowledge that his family continued to suffer consequences for his crimes. His ex-wife had divorced her second husband and moved to rural Montana with the children, tried to escape the stigma that followed them everywhere. Eric's son had joined the army under an assumed name, desperate to restore honor to a family name that had become synonymous with treason. Wendell Jacobs had died in federal prison after a beating that left him comatose for weeks before his life support was disconnected. His children had scattered across the country, changing their names and trying to build lives free from their father's legacy. His wife had committed suicide 6 months after his death, unable to cope with the financial ruin and social ostracism. But Jonathan's most important victory was institutional. The conspiracy's exposure had led to comprehensive reforms in military intelligence, new oversight procedures for defense contractors, and enhanced security protocols that made similar betrayals far more difficult. More personally, Jonathan's reputation had evolved from that of a successful consultant to something approaching legend, a man whose enemies simply disappeared, whose friends prospered beyond measure, and whose word carried the weight of presidential authority. Sitting in his office, Jonathan reviewed a proposal from the Central Intelligence Agency to formalize his role as a deep-cover asset with expanded authority and resources. The offer was tempting. Official government backing would provide even greater protection and access. But Jonathan had learned that true power came from operating in the spaces between official channels, where accountability was limited and methods were unrestricted. His phone buzzed with a text from Shannon Gilmore, a junior senator from California who'd been helpful during the investigation. "Jonathan, I'm facing some opposition research that's gotten very personal. Would you be available for consultation?" Jonathan smiled as he typed his response. "Senator, I'll look into it immediately. Some problems require specialized solutions." This was how power really worked in Washington, not through official channels or public processes, but through quiet conversations and invisible interventions. Jonathan had built a network of people who owed him favors, feared his capabilities, or both. His enemies had learned that betraying him carried consequences that extended far beyond legal punishment, while his allies understood that his protection was absolute and his memory was long. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Vincent Benjamin entered with a tablet containing surveillance reports from around the world. "Sir, we've identified 3 more foreign intelligence operatives trying to penetrate defense contractors using similar methods to the Jacobs operation. Also, there are indications that Chinese intelligence is attempting to recruit the widow of one of our former assets." Jonathan nodded. "Recommendations? Eliminate the threat before it develops. We have the legal authority and the operational capability." "Approved. But Vincent, make sure the message is clear. Anyone who targets American intelligence operations or attempt to compromise our people will face consequences that make the Jacobs conspiracy look merciful." As Vincent left to coordinate the operation, Jonathan returned to his window overlooking the Potomac. The river flowed endlessly toward the Chesapeake Bay, carrying away the remnants of what it had seen while continuing its eternal journey. Like the river, Jonathan had adapted to the landscape around him, becoming a force of nature that reshaped everything it touched. The conspiracy that had nearly destroyed him had instead transformed him into something more dangerous and more powerful than his enemies had ever imagined. Carolina, Eric, and Jacobs had believed they were hunting a successful businessman. They discovered too late that they were actually prey, stalked by a predator whose patience was limitless and whose memory was perfect. In the end, they'd gotten exactly what they'd given: betrayal, suffering, and destruction. The only difference was that Jonathan's version was permanent, comprehensive, and served as a warning to anyone else who might consider crossing him. The dragon had taught his final lesson, and Washington had learned it well. Some men could be beaten, bought, or broken. Jonathan Hampton was not one of them. He was a force of nature, a consequence waiting to happen, a reminder that in the shadow world where power really lived, betrayal was the one sin that could never be forgiven or forgotten.